You don't necessarily have to have a spey rod in order to spey cast. You can use a single hand rod to achieve the same thing. It's personal preference. I like a spey rod, A, because I'm a better two-handed caster than I am a single hand caster. So I feel more confident when I'm out there fishing. I know that I can hit that spot that I want, and I know that I can start fishing quicker. Sometimes with a single hand rod, I'm not as proficient, I'm not as precise. But the other thing with a spey rod is they're longer, so you get more leverage on the fish. You can also get more distance, but that distance isn't necessarily a given because you're going to have to learn how to cast a rod. But that distance is also not a great thing sometimes, because a lot of times I see people, what they do with a spey rod is they're overcasting their fish. They're thinking more about casting rather than fishing. So remember, the spey rod's a great tool for distance, but you don't want to use it specifically for distance. How many times have you overfished, overcast your target? Casting is fun, let's face it, we all love it. When we get a great cast out there, we think, oh my gosh. And that's what's great about these two-handed rods. You can cast a two-handed rod maybe further, especially when you're tight up against the bank. A single hand, you're still doing a dynamic roll cast. And you're limited by how far you can cast a single-handed rod. Two-handed rods, same thing, you have the same back cast, but a lot of times, because we're using two hands and bending that rod a little bit deeper, we can cast that fly rod a little bit further. When we think about spey casting, traditionally, we think about the longer fly rods, two-handed fly rods specifically. And that's something, when I say fly rods, right now I'm speaking about two-handed fly rods. The longer rods were intended to give the caster more distance, more leverage, and more backbone to land bigger fish. When I think about traditional spey casting, I think about fly rods intended to catch salmon and steelhead. These are bigger fish. Now the spey tackle companies have developed fly rods, specifically two-handed trout spey, to catch smaller fish. They've shrunk everything down to make it easier and fun and more enjoyable for us to actually go catch a fish. I mean, who wants to catch a 12-inch trout with a 15-foot rod? It's just not fun, and it's not good for the fish. That's the other thing. These rods are applicable and built for the intended species. So right here I have a single hand rod. This is a 6-weight rod. It's 8.5-foot fiberglass, and what I have on it is a Trout Spey line. This here is what we traditionally call a Scandi line. It has a body. Then we have a running line or shooting line. This is what we call our shooting head systems. This is not much different than the old days when they had single hand fly rods and they would go out and shoot for salmon and steelhead with the single hand shooting head systems. Trout spey rods are shorter than traditional spey rods and lighter to hand, but yet they're longer than your traditional single hand rod. For example, here I have a Trout Spey rod. It's an 11-foot 3-inch 3-weight. We have a line that's developed specifically for that fly line, and what we use it for is for smaller fish. The traditional spey rods, the longer, heavier rods, we're using to catch bigger fish. So when we think about a single hand fly rod, we're thinking for trout, and your typical Western river, we think 4, 5, and 6-weight. The trout speys that are equivalent to your 4, 5, and 6-weight single hand rods are your 2, 3, and 4-weight two-handed rods. So let's say we had a 6-weight single hand. I think of that is equivalent to a 3-weight two-handed rod. Also, trout speys can sometimes get confused with switch rods. In my mind, a switch rod, and you can do this with any rod, but a switch rod is specifically designed to both cast single hand and with two hands. They're the more traditional weights, which is your 7, 8s, and 9 weights. I like to use just a specific Spey rod. And then if I wanted to, I would go ahead and use my single hand rod. So, why are these lighter and shorter? Well, first of all, we're pursuing smaller fish. The second reason is if you're pursuing smaller fish and use a rod that's too heavy for that fish, it's actually going to hurt that fish. And it's also going to take the enjoyment out of it. First of all, you're going to get fatigued and tired because you're carrying around this heavy gear. And second of all, it's just not fun to be overgunned. You really want to match your equipment to the fishery that you're fishing for. So for example, I probably wouldn't take my traditional, my 2-3 weight up to Alaska to fish for those Alaskan trout. Those are bigger fish. They're more salmon steelhead size. So I would actually go to a more traditional Spey rod, which would be your 6, 7, and 8 weight. Each of these fly rods have fly lines and reels that are developed specifically for those weight of rods. So here I have a Spey rod, right? But I also have a Scandi line. Well, there's all types of Scandi lines. There's longer Scandi lines, which are 22 feet, but here, this one is 16 feet. The reason why it's 16 feet is because it's shorter for a shorter rod. Basically what I'm trying to say is there's an outfit for every Spey rod. You just need to go out and explore, find what works for you, and stick with it. Personally, what might work for you isn't going to work for me, or what works for me isn't going to work for you. The idea is to go out, enjoy yourself, and really just find what works for you. So that's a disclaimer. So anything I talk about in this video, it's a starting point. It's a place for information. Go ahead, try it, but if it doesn't work for you, there's always a second way to do things. Especially if I'm trying to say something and if you've got a shoulder injury or back injury and it hurts, stop. Because there's always another way to do it.